New features in Presentation Server 4.5. All right, well, we're to the third and final nugget in this short series that updates you on what you need to know about the differences between Presentation Server 4 and version 4.5. We've talked about the high-level changes. We've talked about the differences between the Presentation Server console and the Access Management console. And now we're going to focus down onto a couple of new features that are specifically important for you to know, not only for the test, but just because they're new things that you may want to incorporate into your Presentation Server infrastructure. These four features are the new config logging capability, the health monitoring and recovery capability, the trusted server configuration that's more focused on the client side, and then also the farm and server monitoring, which is not entirely new with version 4.5, but it's instead I want to bring this up as a contrast between the health monitoring and recovery capabilities and this farm and server monitoring capabilities. Now, some of these are going to be available in different versions of Presentation Server. You're going to get configuration logging no matter what version you have, but you will only get health monitoring and recovery if you use the Enterprise or Platinum versions of Presentation Server 4.5. Trusted Server Config also comes because the client piece comes with any of the versions that are available, and Farm and Server Monitoring is a component of Resource Manager. So these are the features that you're going to get depending on what sorts of versions you have, and depending on the needs that you have for your infrastructure, the needs you have for your environment, you may want to enable these features because they provide a lot of very interesting capabilities for you. I'm going to bring up here the Access Management console here to show you just a little bit about what these components are and how they're interesting. Now, the first one that we want to talk about is really this config logging capability. And the config logging capability arrives here inside of the properties of our farm. If I choose the properties of the farm and then scroll down to configuration logging, this is the location that we actually skipped over in the last nugget. If you think about all of the different capabilities and all the different configurations that are maybe set in your farm or on the servers in your farm, you may want some location, kind of like the event log, where you are able to actually put all of the configurations and when those configurations have changed and which administrators may have made change to your farm into a single location for the purposes of auditing. You may also want it there for the purposes of later troubleshooting if you're trying to figure out why your environment isn't working the way it should be. Perhaps somebody made a change at some point in the past that needs to be undone to make the environment work correctly. Well, the configuration logging database is a separate database that is installed to a SQL Server, an MSDE instance, or even an Oracle instance that your Presentation Server farm has the ability to connect to. This separate database includes all of the characteristics associated with the different configurations that may be in your farm. Now, I want to show you first of all, before we actually configure the database, I'm going to open up the SQL Server Management Studio here, and I'm going to show you that we've already created a couple of databases here. One for configuration logging and one for company knowledge we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. This configuration logging database is what we're actually going to use to connect to in order to begin the logging of our configuration changes for our Presentation Server farm. Again, this is just focused on those configuration changes that may be made by an administrator. You'll see here that we currently have no database type associated with this database configuration, and if I click the button to actually configure the database, this will bring forward a wizard that allows me to configure that connection to that database. You'll see here that I have a SQL Server connection that's capable and an Oracle connection that's capable. I'm actually going to connect to CTX Nugget, which is the location where I have that SQL Server instance installed. Now, I'm going to use SQL Server authentication and the SA password, and as you'll see, if I click here, it's going to give me an error message because Windows Security is actually more recommended for this connection, but for the purposes of this filming, it's actually easier for me to use a SQL Server authentication, and I'm going to punch in the password here. Now, if you go to the Presentation Server Administrator's Guide, it will give you some very specific details for how you may want to lock down this database so that it has the exact correct permissions that are necessary for that connection to occur. This is, if you're using a highly secure environment, if you want to make sure that that environment is particularly locked down, you're going to want to go to that Administrator's Guide to get the specific configuration that is necessary for permissions. In this case, for the purposes of this filming, I just want to make that connection so I can show you how this works. I put the information in here and click the Next button, and then I get the opportunity to choose the database for configuration logging. In this case, obviously, I'm going to choose that configuration logging database. In the next connection, I have a couple of different options that I can select in terms of the connection itself and also connection pooling. One of the things that you're going to have make a decision of is whether or not you want to use encryption as part of that connection. Now, if you're going to use encryption, there's going to be some certificate work required in order for you to be able to encrypt that connection from your Citrix servers to the database. And that database needs to be available for all of those Citrix servers or presentation servers that are available in your environment. In our case, we're actually not going to use encryption so that we don't have to work with the certificates, but these options are available for you for that connection with the database. If I click the next button here, you'll see the test database connection. If I click the button, you'll see that a connection was successfully established with that specified database. You're going to want to make sure that you see this dialog box appear before you actually click Finish. Once we click the Finish button here, you'll see that our database type is now set to Microsoft SQL Server, and we can begin logging administrative tasks to that database by checking this button here. Now you'll see when I check this box that another option appears associated with when the database may be disconnected from the presentation servers. When this occurs, if for some reason the SQL database is not able to log those changes from our presentation server farm, do we want to actually allow changes to the farm when the farm cannot talk to the database? What this ensures is that for highly secure environments, when my database is not available to actually receive that information about those changes, do I actually want to lock down the presentation server farm so that it cannot be changed until the database is available? Now, obviously, this is good because you're going to ensure auditing capabilities, but it may be bad if you have to make an emergency change to the farm when that database is disconnected. This is going to be an architectural change you're going to want to make based on the needs of your environment. Also, and this is very important, associated with these config logging databases, especially in their audit capability, is whether or not you want to require administrators to enter in database credentials before they can actually clear the log. What this allows you to do is create a separate database credential store, username and password associated with that connection, for the purposes of actually clearing the log. Now, if you think about it, if you're creating a configuration logging database and you want to protect yourself against an administrator doing some sort of change that they shouldn't be doing, you may want to have a separate database credential for clearing that log so that certain administrators are not able to actually clear the log. So consider this as a pretty good idea if auditing capability is very important for your environment. Now, once all this has actually been configured, the way that we actually go through and identify what changes have been made and actually view the contents of the database is back up here into the Report Center. Once that database has been created, we can actually pull our configuration logging report, which is a standard report here that's available by default, to actually pull the information back out of that database. If we right-click the logging report here and choose Generate Report, it will actually allow us to create a specification for connecting to that database to actually pull the information back out. Now, this isn't really much different from the way things were done in version 4.0, but it is going to pull a different set of information associated with what sorts of changes have been made. So this is the way you would actually go through and create a report for viewing that information. The final task associated with configuration monitoring is actually clearing the database itself. I want to show you that the process of actually clearing that database is very simple. If we go back to the Nugget farm here and we look at our available tasks, we can actually clear that configuration log by choosing Clear Configuration Log here. Again, if you have selected that checkbox to actually enter in credential information before you can clear the log, you're going to need to enter that credential information prior to successfully clearing the log. And again, this is a security feature that's added into the database. So this is the process of setting up and actually viewing that configuration log information here within version 4.5. The next thing we want to actually talk about is the health monitoring and recovery capabilities that are set up with version 4.5. And again, this is another piece of capability that we actually skipped over in the last nugget because it is completely new to version 4.5. I want to actually scroll down here to the health monitoring and recovery information, which is down here in the bottom of our properties of the farm. You'll see here under health monitoring and recovery, by default, we have selected to actually run a series of health check tests across all the servers in the farm. If I scroll over here and let you see a little bit more about what these tests are, by default, out of the box, we are actually running 4 different tests, checking to see if the IMA service is functioning properly, if the login monitor is functioning properly, some terminal services information, and also the XML service, whether or not it is functioning properly. If I actually click in here and view Modify to take a look at some more details associated with this test, you'll see that we have a test name and actually an interval associated with the test, a number of times the test will fail before a recovery action is taken, and also a timeout associated with that. What these tests are there for is to actually run automatically over an extended period of time while the farm is actually operating. And if those tests fail, you have the option of selecting a number of different elements. You can choose to alert yourself when the tests fail. You can actually remove the server from load balancing. You can shut down IMA or even restart IMA or even reboot the server if you want. Now, these tests are actually set up as executable files here. You'll see IMA test.exe is the executable file that was created by Citrix for the purposes of actually running the test. Once this test is run, if the test actually fails 5 times over a period of 60 seconds, then you're going to actually run that recovery action here, which in this case is alert. Now the idea here is that if there's something wrong with the Citrix IMA service, or if there's something wrong with terminal services, or any of the components that are a part of these tests, you may want to alert yourself, or there may be a problem that is so large in your environment that you may want to entirely remove that server from load balancing, or even reboot the server or restart its IMA service. What this allows you to do is automatically and proactively resolve the problems before they actually occur. Now, you're going to have to be careful with this, because anytime that you're automatically selecting an action that happens whenever you have a problem, in this case the Citrix IMA service actually shutting down, you may not necessarily want to reboot the server, but you may find it necessary to remove that server from load balancing as necessary. A good suggestion is to start with alerting yourself only, and get a feel for actually how these tests operate and when these tests may actually work. Now you can actually create your own custom health monitoring tests by checking this box here and adding in a new test file. Now to create your own test files is going to involve some development work using the Citrix SDK for actually creating those tests, and this is really a non-trivial sort of thing. It's not really something you're going to need to know for the test, but if you have that development capability, you can actually create your own custom health monitoring tests as necessary. I'm going to click the cancel here, and you'll see that if I want to create my own health monitoring tests, I would do so by hitting the new button here and actually entering in all the information here. But make sure you check this box that will allow you to run those custom health monitoring tests. Citrix provides this box because if you're creating your own custom health monitoring tests, they're not actually functionally supported by Citrix, and so there needs to be an extra checkbox here to make sure that you really are sure that you want to do that. Now you can see here that anytime you run a test, one of the options is actually removing that server from load balancing. And you may find that over the course of time that if you have multiple servers that are failing tests, you can actually reduce the overall functionality of your Citrix farm. And so Citrix provides the capability of actually limiting how much removal of servers out of that load balancing you can actually do before the tests no longer attempt to remove servers. And that's up here in the top box here. You'll see Health Monitoring and Recovery. We have the ability to limit the percentage of servers that are actually removed from load balancing when they fail a test. This actually prevents you from overdoing the removal of servers from load balancing and removing too many servers from load balancing when a large number of servers are having problems. You'll see here by default that we are set to limiting the number of servers to just 10% in the farm. Now remember, I told you in one of the earlier nuggets that a lot of these 4.5 updates are really related to very large environments. And as you can see here, 10% of the servers in your environment means that one server is taken offline for every 10 servers that are in your environment. So be very cognizant about what this percentage is for limiting the servers in your environment. Now, I told you that these health monitoring and recovery tests are important because they're important in comparison with some of the other tests that are available for you down here under the monitoring configuration. This monitoring configuration is what you're used to seeing associated with Resource Manager. If I go back to the Citrix Presentation Server console here, and we take a look at the Resource Manager node associated with a particular server, you'll see that there are these green checkboxes that are available associated with that server. And I bring this up because you want to be aware that the Resource Manager tests are different than the tests that are done for health monitoring and recovery. If I go back here, you'll see that the monitoring configuration for the farm monitoring and server monitoring actually allows me to view what sorts of tests are done for Resource Manager. On the farm monitoring tab, I have the ability of choosing whether or not the hot fixes are installed, or the primary farm metric server is running, or the number of servers in a zone are too high, or the rate of session disconnects are too high. Down here under server monitoring, I have the ability of looking at different things like network interface and page file and processor use. Again, these tests provide alerts inside of your AMC console and also in your presentation server console for alerting you when conditions occur, but they are different than the health monitoring and recovery tests. Now, one thing I do want to show you is associated with these farm monitoring and server monitoring capabilities. If we go here and take a look at the knowledge associated with these available alerts, we can actually display the available knowledge that was provided by Citrix associated with these alerts. Now, you'll see we have some information here about summary and other information, even some associated resolutions associated with that problem. Now, if I click here, we have the ability of adding in some additional company knowledge to the alert knowledge that's associated with this problem. Now, in order to do that, however, we have to configure a company knowledge database as well for storing that knowledge information. If I click the Configure Company Knowledge Database, it brings up a very similar connection wizard that we've seen before with actually setting up config logging. And here we actually need to set up an MSDE or SQL Server instance and connect to our server just like we did before, CTX Nugget, and use a specific username username and password just like we did before, and I'm going to use the SA password just like I did before. Oops, I'm punching the right password there. And click the next button, and I want to connect actually to the correct database, which in this case is the company knowledge database. I also want to make sure that I disable encryption because I don't have certificates installed here, and actually test the database connection. You'll see here that we've successfully established the connection with the database, and once we've done that, we can click the Finish button. Once we've done that, we'll have the ability of actually entering in information that is specific to our company related to these errors. Now, you see here what the idea is. Citrix provides its own information associated with these errors, but there may be some specific company knowledge related to our particular installation that is useful for us to add. If I click here, I can add a knowledge base article with a subject and some information about that knowledge base. This is a known problem. And then I can add in information here, known problem. And when I do that and hit the OK button, you'll see that information is actually entered into the company knowledge information here. What this allows me to do is identify when this alert kicks off, providing some additional information specific to our environment that lets the administrators know that something is going correctly or something is going wrong, or maybe again like this is a known problem. All of this information is available to you as a function of Resource Manager. It is presented both in the Access Management Console and in the Citrix Presentation Server console. So we've talked so far about 3 of the 4 new features in Presentation Server 4.5. The one thing we haven't actually talked about yet is this Trusted Server Config, or Trusted Server Configuration. Now, if you think about the different clients that are connecting into the servers in your environment, you may want certain clients to connect into the servers in your environment, maybe only in certain circumstances. Maybe you want to actually identify which servers are considered trusted in your environment and only connect to those servers because they are considered trusted. The way that we actually do this is in the installation of the client, and we do this specifically in the installation of the client through group policy. I'm actually going to bring up the group policy management editor here. gpmc.msc, and we're going to create a new group policy so I can show you some of the information associated with the trusted server configuration. I'm going to create a new group policy and link it to the domain here. We'll call it Citrix Client Policy. And then what we need to do to actually leverage this information is actually add in a specific administrative template associated with Citrix. This administrative template is actually available in the Citrix media. You're going to find it actually located here. If I click the Start button and run, I can go down to the location CPS45ENW2K3. This is the Citrix media, Citrix Presentation Server, Program Files, Citrix, Application, ICA Client, Configuration. And you'll see here that we have an ICA Client.adm file that can be used for actually managing the configuration of our ICA client. Let me go back to the Microsoft Management Console here and take a look at the actual policy that we're attempting to create. I want to actually add the template into this location so we can look at the Citrix related configurations that are available to us. I'm going to paste that location in here and double click to add the ICA Client.adm file in there. Once I've done that, I'm going to have a new administrative template for this GPO that I can use to actually manage these Citrix components. Now you'll see here under Citrix Components I have Presentation Server Client, and I have a couple of elements associated with that Presentation Server Client. I can do some configuration associated with the user experience, I can do some associated with remoting client devices, and even some user authentication capabilities. The one that I'm interested in here is called Network Routing, and the one that I'm specifically interested in is the one titled Configure Trusted Server Configuration. In this case, when I configure a trusted server configuration, what I'm going to enforce is only connecting to those servers that are in specific Windows Internet zones. Now you'll see here that there are two options for me. I can choose to connect to those servers that are in the trusted zone, or those servers that are in the trusted or intranet zones. Now where this is actually found is inside of Internet Explorer. If I take a look at Internet Explorer and go to Tools, and Internet Options here, you'll see that I have the option of choosing some of the zones that are available for me. In this case, I have the Internet Zone, the Local Internet Zone, and the Trusted Sites Zone. These zones are where we can actually identify which servers and which sites we consider trusted. Now I can add in servers manually into this site here, or I can even use group policy to add those in as well. Let me show you actually where we would do that leveraging group policy. Once I enter in, for example, the Windows Internet Zone, if I choose Trusted here, that will actually say I'm only interested in connecting to those servers that are in that Trusted Internet Zone. If I want to use group policy to manage how those servers actually make their way into that zone, I can do so under Windows Settings, Internet Explorer Maintenance, and Security. And under Security Zones and Content Ratings, if I double-click and choose to import in the current security zones and privacy settings and select the Modify Settings button, you'll see that I have the same settings here that I had inside of Internet Explorer. If I choose Trusted Sites here and Sites again, I can actually use this wizard to input in the servers that I want to trust so the clients actually connect into those servers properly. I'm going to close this down and hit Cancel here. You'll see this is a relatively complicated way of actually identifying which servers I actually want to trust. But if you leverage a large trust path in your organization relative to Internet Explorer, this may be of use to you. If, however, you want to do it a much simpler way, we can go back to configuring our trusted server configuration. Instead of using Windows Internet Zones, what we can choose instead is to actually hard identify those addresses that are available. Maybe I want to identify star.whatever, finance.citrix.com or cpsstar.citrix.com. Or maybe enter in star.nuggetlab.com here. This allows me to specifically identify which servers I want without actually having to go through all of this identifying of zones and plugging things into the Windows Internet Zones. So this allows me to trust those servers specific to which types of zones they're in or which types of servers I've identified as trusted for those clients to connect. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about 4 new features with Presentation Server 4.5 and how you can actually leverage and install and make use of them in your Presentation Server infrastructure. We talked about configuration logging and how configuration logging provides a single location for you to identify what changes have been made in your environment. We talked about the health monitoring and recovery, which is a way of identifying what sorts of problems may be occurring and automatically providing results and solutions to those problems, whether that be taking servers out of the load balancing, rebooting them, or restarting their IMA service. We talked about the trusted server config and how you can identify to clients which servers are actually trusted for those clients to configure, and then also some changes to farm and server monitoring, and how farm and server monitoring is very different from health monitoring, and it uses the traditional resource manager information to actually populate its information. And with this, we actually conclude this short 3-video update from 4.0 to 4.5 for Citrix Presentation Server. Again, my name is Greg Shields. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.